How many of you have been absolutely disgusted by the style and tone, much less the substance of this year's election? Anybody? How many of you become really discouraged about the state of politics in America? I keep reading articles about reaching a new low in campaign rhetoric. And it's not just the candidates who are screaming at each other. I can't bear to watch a news program where you have so-called debates between advocates for two parties screaming, yelling, name-calling, and talking over each other. You know, one thing it proves is that our nation is becoming more and more politically divided and, frankly, more and more angry. So what can the church say? We've started a series called Citizens of Heaven, and we're talking about, we have dual citizenship, so to speak. We have a citizenship in heaven and a citizenship on earth, and how do we relate to both, and how do we deal with this disintegrating political picture and this chaos? Well, I've been pastor for over 40 years, and every presidential election year since I've been pastoring, I've had people come up to me and say, "How should I vote?" How do you think a Christian should vote? It's interesting that Jesus in the Bible doesn't tell us how to vote. Don't miss this. He tells us how to live. Jesus doesn't tell us how to vote. He tells us how to live. He's not really as concerned with our votes as he is with our values. He believes that our influence should come primarily not from our political convictions, but from our personal character. And so I'm going to read a passage of Scripture from 1 Peter chapter 2. I'm going to read it out of the NIV, 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to start with verse 9. Now, what verse 9 is going to do is, as we read it, it's going to summarize our pastor's message from last week. It kind of summarizes it. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you're a people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles. Now, what Brad told us last week is this. We have a citizenship in heaven, and we are exiles here. We are foreigners. We are strangers. But in the fact that we are foreigners and strangers, we are also part of a colony of heaven, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Now, what Peter's trying to do is he's establishing the fact that Jesus is the cornerstone of a spiritual temple. And once you build a spiritual temple, which is metaphorically the church, then you need a priesthood. And the members of that church are the priesthood. We are the priests that serve and sacrifice and act as intermediaries between God and those who don't know him. We're a royal priesthood. We're this colony, this group of exiles, this group of pilgrims, and that speaks of a short stay, and our stay is very short on this planet. That's who we are. So that begs the question, how then shall we live? If that's us, how shall we live? And then let's read on. It says, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul, Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Wow, what a challenge. What I see in there is four basic things that we need to do as we live now as exiles in a pagan world. What do we need to do? The first C I want to talk about, and there are four C's. The first one is character. He says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Wow. We're talking about character. We're talking about living in such a way that people see our lives and we attract them by our lives to Jesus Christ. But what is the world's view of Christians now? In our country, when you say the word Christian, what do people who aren't Christians think about us? Jesus preached the most famous sermon in the world. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus gave the description of the character of his followers. And I'm going to go through 3 or 4. And what I want you to do is ask yourself these questions. How did Jesus think Christians would influence the world? And secondly, what is Jesus' description of his followers? And what should be the public face of Christianity in America? What should Americans think when they hear the word Christian? For example, in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, Matthew 5:7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Jesus said to his followers, your influence will be directly related to your display of mercy. It's the public face of Christianity in America that Christians are merciful people, that if I make a mistake, if I mess up, if I've done something I'm ashamed of, and you meet a Christian or you go to church, that they're probably going to show mercy. They're going to love me in spite of what I've done. They're going to love me in spite of what I look like because they are merciful people. If you come in the presence of a Christian, your mistakes are not going to be thrown in your face. You're going to be treated kindly. Now let me ask you something. Is mercy really the face of Christianity in our society? Or are we seen as judgmental? How about Matthew 5:9? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Is the public face of Christianity in America that Christians are all about making peace, breaking down dividing walls, bringing people together, trying to figure out how we can get along, how we can build a more inclusive society, a more welcoming society? Christians are folks who do not start wars. They are asked to end them. How about Matthew 37? Matthew 5:37, it says all you need to say as a Christian is yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. Is the public face of Christianity in America that Christians are people whose word you can count on? When a Christian makes a deal with you in business, you can take it to the bank. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest threat to America does not come from outside the church. The biggest threat to Christianity in America comes from inside the church, from Christians who don't look like or sound remotely like Jesus Christ's description of a Christian. We are not like him. I'm going to tell you something. In this election year, what the world needs most is not another political agenda from the church. Hear me. Surveys tell us that one of the reasons so many people, especially millennials, are leaving the church is because Christians act like just another political interest group fighting for a piece of the pie. What the world needs now most is an attractive alternative to the fallen world of politics. The world is desperate for a model of the good life embodied in a community of people. And Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:14 through 16, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." How then shall we live? We shall live with the character that Jesus says his church should have, and will become attractive to a lost world. They'll see our good deeds and glorify God in heaven. We must be merciful, peacemakers, people of integrity. People are desperate to see a community of people in which old and young, singles and married, parents and children are living, thriving, vibrant lives together in peace. Black, white, Asian, and Hispanic, Democrats and Republicans. So I ask you again, what is the public face of Christianity in America? Through this election, what is the public face? Even at the Republican National Convention, a pastor said that the Democrats and Hillary Clinton are our enemies. God help us. We have an enemy as pastors. The church has an enemy. But it's not Republicans or Democrats. You hear me? God is not a Republican. And he is not a Democrat. He's of the Libertarian Party. We all know that. Good night. You know, some people think he's a Republican because of, and here's what I hear from Christians, well, if Jesus voted today, he'd vote Republican because of the Supreme Court, because you know the Supreme Court could legalize abortion, and so God is definitely a Republican. Then you go to the next Christian, and he'll say, no, God is definitely a Democrat. Because he has said through his word that we are not to build walls to keep people out. We are to welcome people and refugees. Doesn't he say that? Or have I misread the Bible? What I'm trying to point out is he's neither one. And how shall we live? We must be men of character who do not believe for 1 minute that a political party can co-opt God in the church and use it as an instrument to retain or gain power. That is absurd. I want to read what a pastor wrote. What if we Christians took Jesus seriously and tried to actually put into practice the Sermon on the Mount? You know what? This is what they would say. You know what? I don't necessarily believe what those Christians believe about God. But the truth is that those Christians live better lives than I do. I really admire their families. I really admire their marriages. I love having a Christian work for me. You have to hand it to those Christians. They care about our city. They mentor kids in public schools. Whenever there's a need in the community, the first thing I think of is, let's call the church. People are hungry. Let's call the church. There's a conflict between the police and African American community. Let's call the church, because the church is a place of understanding. The church will show us how to listen to each other. They'll show us how to show respect to each other. My friends, my fellow followers of Christ, listen to me now. Jesus gave us something much more powerful and influential than our attachment to some political party, an incredibly attractive way to live that would elicit the admiration of the world if we did it. Pastor goes on to write, I fear that we, like Esau in the Old Testament, have traded in our birthright for a bowl of lentils sold to us by a political party. And God forbid. The second C, the first one is character, the second one is civility. He says in 1 Peter, verse 17, show respect to everyone. But in our country, it seems that you no longer have to be civil in an election year. In this election year, a number of candidates have said incredibly disparaging things about different people and different groups, and then justified them with the rejection of political correctness. What I would suggest in America as a whole is that we do not shy from free inquiry or the pursuit of truth or discussing various topics. Politically powerful groups shout us down, but that doesn't matter. But we need to draw a distinction. We, in the freedom of expression, do not have the right to harass or threaten others. In other words, an attack on political correctness is not some blanket absolution for the loss of civility. Now, what is civility? Civility is public politeness. It simply means that we display tact, moderation, and good manners towards people who are different than us or with whom we disagree. Civility is not just public, it's internal. Civility is a heart of commitment in which we want to see. Ladies and gentlemen, I've even heard Christians discussing elections this year, and they weren't civil to each other. How can that be? How can that be? It can be because we get very passionate when someone attacks our idols. And I'm afraid that some of us really believe that our future is dependent upon who gets elected. God forbid our future is dependent on Him. Amen? Now here's an interesting C. The third one is contact. Contact. And to cover this point, I also want to add in another scripture, Jeremiah, verse 29, when we talk about contact. they've taken some of the best and brightest of Israel, and they've taken them, Judah, taken them to Babylon. Jeremiah's in Jerusalem, and he's writing them a letter, and he's going to tell them how to live in Babylon. They're exiles. And they're in a pagan society, and so he's going to tell them how to live in this pagan society. And so he sends a letter with two guys. Now, there's some guys in Babylon who are telling the people, you're only going to be in captivity 2 years, so don't get too attached. But Jeremiah is writing them to tell them that you are going to be in captivity 70 years. And so he writes this in verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that we too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity. Also, don't miss this, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. Then I want to read verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. You know, they're in exile, and they're God's chosen people. And these false prophets are telling them, you're going to be there just 2 years. And Jeremiah's sending them a letter saying, you're going to be there 70 years. Because you see, God is not always a microwave Messiah. Sometimes he's a crock pot redeemer who specializes in slow cooking. While waiting, don't blame people or place. You can prosper in the city where you are. Start where you are with what you have and do what you can. You cannot start where you are not. You cannot use what you do not have, and you cannot do what you cannot do. That's what he's saying. You're in exile. You're a foreigner. You're a stranger. You're a pilgrim, just like us. So, he gives us some instructions. He tells us that we are to maximize the moment, prioritize our relationship with God, participate in constructive activities, not destructive ones, work on relationships, build community, cling to hope, pursue God. And if you do, you will prosper. He has plans for you to prosper. But what does that mean in Hebrew? According to Webster, prosperity means the condition of being successful or thriving, especially economic well-being. That is certainly not what wholeness means, and even welfare has quite different connotations. As it turns out, the Hebrew word means shalom. It's shalom. Normally, this word is translated peace. But it has a much wider range of meaning than our word peace. The theological word book of the Old Testament uses the words to describe what he's saying when he says prosperity. He says, I will make you complete. I will make you whole. I will give you harmony. I will make you fulfilled. It's talking about unimpaired relationships with God and people. So it's not, the emphasis of the word is not an economic prosperity, but more a positive relational prosperity with God and others. It says, I will give you a healthy relationship with God and a healthy relationship with others. You will prosper because, ladies and gentlemen, we were meant to prosper in relationship, not in wealth. Wealthy people are unhappy a lot of times. There's a theory in sociology called the contact hypothesis, which says that the best way to improve relations between groups that experience conflict is to bring those groups together in situations that lower barriers and promote personal action. That's what was said in the announcements. We want to make contact with people who are not of this colony. We want to rescue people from the enemy. It takes contact. That's the contact hypothesis. It's been tested and proven hundreds of times in the last 60 years. If you bring people together under the right conditions where we promote personal interaction and friendship, prejudice will break down, stereotypes will break down, appreciation and mutual understanding will rise. I have seen this in my own life. Haven't you seen this in yours? I grew up in northwest Oklahoma City. I never spoke to a black person until I was 16 years old. And what happened was, in my 100% white school, a black family moved in to the district, and they came to our school. It was tough for him. And I was a Christian. I loved Jesus, but just didn't trust him. So when I was a junior in high school, he was there, but I had nothing to do with him. I never remember speaking to him purposefully. So I won the Outstanding Christian Athlete Award at our school, which came with it a trip to FCA. And so I went with 17 all-state athletes to Colorado Springs for a week. And when we got there, and there were mixed races, when we got there, much to my dismay, my roommate was black. Forced contact. But he had gone to an all-black school, and he didn't know very many whites. I'll never forget walking into the room. He's there, and I'm there. He looked like a person. So we did whatever you would do as Christians. We were both Christians. We shook hands and said, "I'm Paul," and he said, "I'm Herman," and I said, "Great to meet you," and he said, "Great to meet me," and then I said, "Well, tell me about your family," and he said, "Tell me about yours." When he got through, and pretty soon we're talking, and pretty soon we're laughing together, and we spent a week together. And at the end of the week, we were friends. I genuinely liked him. He liked me. And we did things together. And it wasn't awkward because we just met each other, and the stereotypes went away, and the fear and all of it went away because we had contact. We got together. And we talked, and we found out we were just 16-year-old guys with moms and dads and brothers and sisters, and it all melted away. We need to spend time with others that we don't know, that we don't understand. I believe that a church like ours, this church right here, will be the perfect environment to break down our prejudices and generalizations, our fears and our harsh opinions that we have about people with different views. We can meet here. We can get contact. We can spend time with them. And those stereotypes will break down. Even political perspectives will fade away. Close contact with people and the building of friendships across racial, economic, social, and political differences can especially happen in small groups. Christians in small groups are the perfect environment to break down dividing walls. That's why we don't want to make the small groups of all the same kinds of people. We need to have contact. That's why this church does missions. That's why this church helps others. That's why this church goes out to make contact. Here's the last C, Christ-centered. We need to have godly character. We need to be civil to each other. We need to make contact with those that we misunderstand and build relationships and understand them, and we'll begin to love them. The last one is Christ-centered. Jesus is not a conservative Republican, and he's not a liberal Democrat. He's not a libertarian or a follower of the Green Party. Don't give your ultimate loyalty, your heart, your passion, the very core of your being to anything other than him. Many Christians in America have made their political affiliations an idol. You know you have an idol in your life when that thing is removed, you're devastated, you're destroyed. If your house burns down or you lose your job, you may be really sad. You say, what am I going through is really hard. But if your possessions or your job has become an idol, you say, this is the end, there is no hope, my life is over. According to Tim Keller, pastor of Redeemer Church in New York, current politics has become an idol in America. Here is what Keller writes. When either party wins an election, a certain percentage of the losing side talks openly about leaving the country. They become agitated and fearful for the future. Have you heard anybody say this year, if Hillary is elected president, we're going to leave the country? Yes, I have. What about if Donald Trump is elected? I mean, Trump, what if he's elected? Are you going to leave the country? If that's true, they've put their hope in the political leaders and policies that once was reserved for God and for the work of the gospel. When their political leaders are out of power, they experience a death. They believe that if their policies and people are not in power, everything will fall apart. In our politics, we believe that opponents are not simply mistaken, they are absolutely evil. And that has to stop. Let's draw a triangle. At the top, put Jesus Christ. At the bottom, let's just do it because this is a political year, just for fun. Don't get all upset here. Let's put Republican. On the other end, let's put Democrat. So you got Jesus at the top. On this corner, you have Republican. On this corner, on the right, you have a Democrat. Okay? And they're Christians. But they have diversely opposed opinions about everything. They have been uncivil to each other. Well, how can they get rid of that hostility and move together and love each other like they should and even like each other? Well, they try to become more like Jesus. And as they become more like Jesus, the distance between them gets smaller. And as they become Christ-like, pretty soon they can begin to discuss their issues and talk about them in the terms of Christian principles and the goal of God for each life. And pretty soon there's no longer a division. We have to love each other as we love Christ. We need to move close to Jesus. How then shall we live? We must live with character. We must live civilly. We must live in contact with those we disagree and are different than us. And then we must become more and more like Jesus. That will evaporate those differences, and we will love them, and they will begin to love us because we will know each other. That's how we're going to live. We're going to pray for our country because the prosperity of our country leads to our prosperity. That's what Jeremiah said. We're going to pray for our country. We're going to build relationships, and we're going to be solving the problems, not bemoaning them. Now, I know Brad said last week he wasn't going to tell you who is going to vote for. I'm not either. I'm older than him. I'm smart too, because it doesn't matter who I vote for. Let me tell you why. What if I get into the booth and I'm fully intended to vote for X, and God says to me in my heart, Paul, I want you to vote for Y, because that person is a tool for my judgment on America. And I'm going to use that judgment to bring many people to myself. Can God do that? What would you do if he did? You see, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go and I'm going to pray, God, you guide every person. You guide me in every vote. I want to vote my conviction and my heart, but I will listen to you. That's who should tell you who to vote for. He matters. I don't. Okay? It's an interesting time. I'll be glad to answer any questions about this message you have for me, okay? Because I stand by it. Our character in this time is vital. Civility is supreme. Contact is necessary. And Christ-likeness is what we're called to anyway. Would you bow with me in prayer, please?